Hi, I'm Dr. Musil, and welcome to Lecture 12, Critique of Kantian Deontology, where we talk about what William Frankena has to say about Kant's version of deontology, now that we're all professional academic Kantian experts, right? Now that we've seen the two videos I provided on, Kant's deontology. You obviously have a perfect grasp of everything Kant says. No, obviously none of us do, as I alluded to in those videos. And I highly encourage you, if you're still kind of struggling with Kant, go out, maybe reread, the text. That always helps. But go ahead and look up other videos. Maybe hearing someone else talk a little bit about what Kant has to say could help you. So, and that's true of any of these lectures or any of these people we talk about. It never hurts, I would say, to listen to another lecture on that particular thinker to try to help elucidate, what it is they're actually getting at. But at any rate, obviously we're not experts on Kant by any means, but hopefully we have a general sense of what he's getting at. And as I noted, and I think the part 2 video on that lecture, right, that if nothing else, we have a grasp of this idea of the categorical imperative and being able to universalize whatever it is we're doing, right? That's the key, that's the golden ticket, so to speak. That's key to figuring out what we ought to do and what we ought not to do in particular. Okay, so having that general grasp of Kant's original articulation of deontology will be better than able to appreciate what William Frankena is going to suggest are the issues with that theory. Okay? And we've already talked about an issue with Kant's moral theory. That whole issue with the inaccessibility of motives and intention, right? So Kant himself acknowledges that problem, that's a problem, right? What matters morally for the deontologist is what precipitated the action in the mind of the agent. Did they engage in that rational moral step of applying the categorical imperative to their maxim and so on and so forth to ensure that the maxim wouldn't be at odds with a good will, right? And whatever their duty required. Did they engage in that process? That was a big issue, right? Because not only can we not get in the minds of other people, but as Kant himself acknowledges, how do we ever know that we ourselves aren't being subconsciously sort of driven by selfish motives when we think that we're acting from a more pure motive? So that was a big issue. But Frankena is, as we're going to see, going to point out then some other criticisms of Kant's version of deontology, which many people, have, right? In other words, there were many critics that kind of felt this way. And just like with utilitarianism, as we talked about, we had Bentham's original formulation of the theory, and then you have subsequent utilitarians that come on the scene and they appreciate some of the difficulties that were raised by the critics and they refine the theory, so to speak. Think about rule utilitarianism itself, right? A whole version of utilitarianism that was born out of the criticism that it's too complicated and taxing on the individuals trying to carry it out. So you're going to have people in a similar vein, deontologists, subsequent to Kant, who are going to appreciate some of these criticisms that Frankena is going to raise in particular. And when the previous textbook I used had this dude's, so I'll go ahead and put his name up here, W.D. Ross. They had an excerpt in that book. They had an excerpt from W.D. Ross where he's a deontologist, and he acknowledges one of the issues Frankena is going to raise, and he's going to then so he is also a deontologist. I refer to his deontology as intuitionist deontology. Man, I'm all over the place here. Hopefully you can follow this here, but W.D. Ross is one. Similarly, right, to the utilitarians who appreciate some of the criticisms of utilitarianism, Ross is a deontologist who appreciates some of these initial criticisms of Kant's version of deontology and offers then an account of deontology that is going to accommodate that kind of concern. And so as we're going to see, Ross is going to advocate, rather than advocate ideas as being absolutes, he's going to say no. While we know them a priori, Kant was right in suggesting that we know all these duties, what makes them right, to tell the truth and so on. It's knowable a priori, it doesn't hinge on experience. But Kant failed to appreciate some of these concerns, and we have to view these duties not as being absolutes, but rather prima facie duties, conditional duties. Right? We might have to set certain duties aside to uphold other duties in our actual experience. And we'll get into some of those situations where that seems to be the case. Right? But for now, I'm just pointing out how thanks to the likes of William Frankena and some of the others that offer criticisms of Kant's version of deontology, you get then subsequent deontologists who come along and tidy up the theory, just like we saw was the case with utilitarianism. Okay, so our game plan, again, we're going to talk about some of the issues that Frankena raises with respect to deontology. To understand his general criticism and concern, though, we're going to have to first flesh out a distinction between necessary and sufficient conditions. And it surprised me, I would always take a poll in face-to-face class how many people are familiar with this distinction, and it surprised me at first how few of my students seem to be. And so I guess it's more of a philosophical circle sort of thing. But if you were to read, articles in philosophical journals, you would encounter this all the time. If you were to read, Frankena himself, obviously you're going to encounter this distinction. So we'll flesh out what exactly this means here in a moment, because you need to have a grasp on this distinction then to appreciate Frankena's general position. And what is that position? What is the upshot? Spoiler alert, what's Frankena's view? He's going to suggest that what Kant tells us about morality, specifically, right, the categorical imperative, that golden ticket, so to speak, that, hey, that bit about being able to universalize what you're doing and not doing the things you can't universalize, that's necessary. So he's on board with that. That's interesting. He's on board with that. It's necessary, but he's going to argue it's not enough, not sufficient. So again, we'll talk more about what that means here in a moment. But this is going to be the upshot. What Kant tells us is necessary, but it's not sufficient. So who was, and we'll get into, again, three major problems that he's going to outline for why he thinks that's the case here in a moment. The first two of which he thinks are more or less unsolvable. Now the third one, as we'll see, he thinks is solvable. He himself is going to solve it, so to speak. But he's going to outline two problems in particular that seem substantial, and they don't seem to be able to be eradicated. And those render then what Kant tells us necessary but not sufficient. So let's go ahead and dive in. Turn into slide 2. Who is William Frankena? He was actually pretty prominent, at least in philosophical circles, as an American philosopher, taught at the University of Michigan for decades. And the University of Michigan is a fairly highly touted academic school in general, and it's really well respected in philosophical circles. So, and he taught there for decades. So pretty prestigious guy, pretty well known, especially in moral philosophy. And all of what we talk about is from probably his most famous book that was titled, are you ready for this? Get ready for this. Are you ready? His book was called Ethics. That's right, Ethics. So I think he could have done a little bit better if you couldn't tell on the title. But as I've already, I think, intimated, he does a great job, I think, of succinctly or concisely spelling out some of the major issues people had with Kant's original version of deontology. So that's who he is in general. Without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into this distinction that I mentioned earlier that we have to understand to appreciate his general position with respect to Kant's moral theory, specifically that idea of the categorical imperative. So turning to slide 3 then, let's flesh out this distinction then. So we're going to go ahead and get rid of Frankena here for a moment. Oh man, I'm all over the board today. And we're going to talk about, I'm just going to key in on the examples I actually use on the slides. So we're going to talk about, when we talk about necessary and sufficient conditions or principles, we're talking about those with respect to a kind of outcome. So we're going to talk about, pretend this is a face-to-face class, and so that we would have a certain number of sessions each semester, right? I typically teach in a night class that meets once a week, so 16 to 18 sessions. And my attendance policy is suggested in this example, right? It was, there really wasn't any consequence for missing sessions up to a point. And then if you miss more than 4, though, you can't pass the class. No consequence other than not being, having my wisdom, let that seep in. And, I like to think class is meaningful. But other than that, right, you wouldn't, be penalized. Other than missing more than 4 classes, well, then you can't pass the class. Okay? So we're talking about the outcome we want is passing the class. And so the first thing we're going to talk about is a necessary condition. So I give you an example of a necessary condition for passing the class. What is a necessary condition? It's just like it sounds. right? If you were to try to just define it on the face of it, right? It's something that is necessary for something else to happen, or it's something that's required. So you want to pass the class, one applicable necessary condition then is not missing more than 4 sessions. That is a necessary condition for this, okay? I shouldn't draw an arrow up there necessarily. So if you want this outcome, this has to happen. You can't have this without this. So we know if this takes place, you must have not missed more than 4 sessions, okay? So that's a necessary condition. That's an example. Now, just because you didn't miss more than 4 sessions, you satisfy this. Does that mean you pass the class? Does that guarantee that you pass the class? That's what it would mean to be sufficient. A sufficient condition or principle guarantees the outcome. Okay, is this sufficient for passing the class? Does that guarantee that you'll pass the class? The answer is no, right? Because you might have showed up to every single class, but you were totally tuned out, right? You never listened to anything, or for whatever reason, you just didn't get enough of the points, right? You didn't get 60% of the possible points. So although you met one necessary condition, you didn't meet another. Okay, so ultimately, the whole point being, spoiler alert for the next slide, right? These aren't directly connected. A necessary condition need not be sufficient, right? And just because something is a necessary condition for something doesn't mean that it'll be sufficient, as is the case here. This isn't sufficient for passing the class. And as we'll see in the next slide, I'll give you an example of a sufficient condition not being necessary necessarily either. Necessarily. You get the idea, right? So there's no direct relationship. Just because something is a sufficient condition for something else doesn't mean it'll be necessary. So hopefully at this point, at the bottom of slide 3, I give you an example then of a sufficient condition where if we add, right, if we were to imagine this was a longer sentence and couple that with 60 or more % of the possible points. So how does it read? So a sufficient condition for passing the class would be receiving at least 60% of the possible points and not missing more than 4 sessions. So taken together, all of that is a sufficient condition for passing the class. If you don't miss more than 4 sessions and earn 60% or more of the possible points, you will pass the class. Okay, so this all taken together is a sufficient condition for that. Turning to slide 4 then, we already talked about the way in which, a necessary condition need not be a sufficient condition, right? Just because this is necessary doesn't mean that it'll be a sufficient condition for that. Well, it works the other way too, as I was suggesting a moment ago. Just because you have a sufficient condition for something, it doesn't mean that it'll be a necessary condition for that something. So I give an example at the bottom. I reference the prestigious Kansas City Philosophy Club, which is fictitious, or there probably exists actually a Kansas City Philosophy Club out there. There does exist a j.c.c.c. Did I add enough C's there? j.c.c.c. Philosophy Club. Which I highly encourage you to sign up for if you're not already signed up for it. If you enjoy this sort of thing, it gets together and discusses, philosophy in a much more informal setting. So, highly encouraged. But here we're talking about the prestigious, in this case, fictitious Kansas City Philosophy Club, which, as we all know, you want to join. Fortunately for you, there are 3 ways to get into this club, and all you have to do is satisfy one of the conditions. And they're easy. Have 10 toes. You like to crack knuckles. Or you read Dr. Seuss. So those are, the idea is you meet either any one of those 3 and you're in the club. Actually, I should have put those over here. So those are the 3 things you could do to get in. Be admitted into Kansas City Philosophy Club, KCPC. Okay, so we're going to look at, let's say, having 10 toes. One of those things. This, we know, is a sufficient condition for getting admitted into the Kansas City Philosophy Club. Right. Provided you have 10 toes, you're in the club. Now, was it necessary? No, because you could have liked to read Dr. Seuss, and you still would have been in the club. Even if you, unfortunately, for whatever reason, didn't have 10 toes, you could still get in the club. So while this is sufficient, it guarantees you'll get in the club if you have 10 toes. It wasn't necessary. You didn't have to have 10 toes. You could have liked to crack your knuckles instead or read Dr. Seuss. Okay, so hopefully that's starting to make some sense now. Okay, so what, applying this, I think turning to slide 5 now, applying this to what Frankena is saying about Kant, he wants to know, okay, are we going to know, right, how does Kant's moral theory related to us being able to assign praise and blame to moral people in a moral sense, and to be able to figure out all the things we need to do morally. So the outcome we want is to be the moral know-how we need to, right? So how would you want to put that? Being fully morally equipped, or however you want to put it. Being fully morally equipped. I could probably put that in a much better way, but being fully morally equipped. In other words, knowing who to praise and blame, right? When we ought to praise somebody and when we ought to blame them, what to do in particular situations, right? Are we going to be able to know all that? And we want to know Kant's moral theory, right? How is that related to this? And specifically the CI, this bit about universalizing stuff. And what he's going to say is, hey, this stuff Kant tells us, actually it is necessary. So he likes this bit about being able to universalize what you're doing. Okay? I think that's important to point that out. But he's going to say it's not sufficient. So given everything Kant tells us, it doesn't guarantee this. Okay? It's necessary to be fully morally equipped to try to universalize what you're doing. But applying Kant's theory it's not going to allow us to know what we ought to do in all conceivable situations. It's not going to allow us to know who we ought to praise and blame in all scenarios. Okay, so that's the relationship he's going to argue exists here, right? That it's what Kant's given us is necessary, but it's not sufficient. Okay, so turning to that then, well, in his words, I just meant to mention this. This is the top of slide 5. He says, quote, "Is Kant's criterion," and by that he means the categorical imperative, "sufficient as well as necessary for determining what is morally right or obligatory," end quote. So then we turn to slide 6 and we start getting into the specific problems that he enumerates, okay, which demonstrate this, he thinks. The first 2 of which are substantial, right? And we're going to suggest this is the case. The third one, it's an issue, but Frankena himself is going to kind of solve it for Kant. Okay, so let's go ahead and turn to those problems then. And I'll go ahead and leave Ross up here for a second, because we are going to allude to the problem he kind of addresses. So the first thing we're going to have an issue with is absolute duties. And that's what Ross is going to appreciate, that concern. And specifically, Kant, how can you view duties as being absolutes when it seems like we have situations where we can't possibly uphold multiple duties at the same time? In other words, we're going to have to not do or uphold one duty in order to do or uphold another duty. So Kant, if you're going to view duties this way, how do you accommodate or explain what to do in practical scenarios where duties conflict? So what to do about those situations? And that's where Ross comes on and seems to say, hey, look, this is a problem. That's why you can view these duties as being knowable a priori through intuition, Ross says, or through application of, in our reason, the categorical imperative, Kant would say. So we know these a priori, they both say, right? But the application of these duties can't be thought of as absolute. Ross agrees and argues. They must instead be viewed as conditional, he's going to argue, or prima facie duties. He calls them prima facie. On the face of it, they're duties, but, they're conditional, not absolute, because we might, he agrees, have to set one duty aside to uphold another duty. I might, at some point, I mentioned how, the other textbook I used for a while, I would give a lecture on this. I might offer a video lecture on this at some point, because I think it is pretty useful and interesting to see sort of what results from these criticisms. But so that's the first one we'll talk about here more in a second. And then he's going to suggest that there's this inability, contrary to what Kant thinks, of course, inability on the part of the golden ticket, so to speak, or the categorical imperative, to establish, in fact, all of our duties. Okay, these are significant problems, unsolvable, so to speak, given what Kant tells us. Now, his third problem, as we'll see, Frankena thinks is kind of solvable, and he's going to reference the general ambiguity of the CI. Okay, so we've talked about this before, how Kant's kind of known for being less than clear about certain things, right? And so this shouldn't come as a surprise. He could have been a little bit clearer, Frankena wants to say, and I kind of agree with him for what it's worth, that what Kant tells us about the categorical imperative, it could have been a little bit clearer what he meant by it. Now, we have this general sense that, we can't act on a maxim if it doesn't pass the categorical imperative test, right? But what do we do when a maxim does pass the CI, right? So as we'll see, we have maxims like tell the truth, don't kill innocent people, tie your left shoestring first, whistle when alone in the dark. These are examples he gives, right? These are all maxims that pass the categorical imperative test, but should we view them as duties? Why or why not? So what about things that pass the CI? There's this degree of ambiguity, right? Kant doesn't really flesh that out as much as he could, and so he's going to pick up on that and more or less solve it for Kant. And I agree with, so he's going to say this is what Kant more than likely intended, and I agree with his suggestion of what Kant intended. More on that in a moment, okay? But let's go ahead and dive into these sequentially here. So we'll start with this issue of absolute duties, the one that Ross, a subsequent deontologist, also appreciates. So Frankena is picking up on that, again, the absolute rigid sense of duty that Kant seems to have. Again, this is the same issue Kai Nielsen had when he was talking about the moral absolutist, the way he even referred to this type of moral theory, the deontological camp, the moral conservatives, references them as moral absolutists. That's the problem, right? That they suggested these duties applied categorically or absolutely without exception, and that then allowed them, right? Think of it like the cave scenario. You might think of it as we had two duties there, right? Not to kill an innocent person, but also a duty to help others. And hey, there's 20 others behind us we can help by killing this innocent person. So that would be an example, Frankena would point out, of where you can't uphold both those duties at once. And this is the sort of issue I was raising, the reason why I brought up Nielsen. He would agree that this view of duties as being absolutes, they don't allow for exceptions. That's what he was finding problematic and what he was trying to, again, home in on with respect to the Fat Man in the Cave example. Okay, so Frankena points out, the quote, this is a quote from his book, Ethics. Quote, Kant talks as if he can show that promises ought never to be broken. And so Frankena points out, look, not only does he really never establish that, but in fact, it seems like there are cases where we ought to break the promise. Go way back, what was that? Was that lecture 7 when we were talking about rule and act utilitarianism, I think? We gave Plato's famous madman example where your neighbor comes back wanting their gun and they're in a fit of rage. If you're a Kantian deontologist, you know that gun is in the closet right next to you. You have an absolute duty to tell the truth. Oh, here's your gun. It's right here. And that seems to be problematic because you also have a duty to help others, namely the person he's really ticked off at and about to go kill. Don't you also have a duty to help them, especially when their life is on the line? And this seems to be problematic then. So this is the kind of issue that Frankena is alluding to. How can you, if you view these duties as absolutes, what do you do when it's not possible to uphold them absolutely all at the same time, right? For example, again, that tell the truth. Well, if you tell the truth, then you're not going to be able to help the significant other, and they're going to lose their life. If you help the significant other, then you're not going to be able to tell the truth. So this version of duty or notion of duties of being absolutes is an issue when, in practice or in our experience, living out our lives, these duties conflict, and it's not possible to uphold them all. And so he gives examples, right? He says, quote, keeping a promise might on occasion prevent one from helping someone in trouble. So I promise I'll be at your house at 8 o'clock so we can study for the ethics test. Okay? I promise I'll be there at 8. And I'm on my way and I see somebody, in a car that's burning on fire and they can't get out and they need help. I have a duty to help others. I have a duty to fulfill my promise. Again, I can't, the idea being if I stop to help the stranger or the person in the car, then I'll be late and I won't fulfill my promise. I can't do them both at the same time. What Kant gives us isn't good enough, right? It's not sufficient to figure out what we ought to do in those kinds of scenarios. Okay, so again, the idea is Kant's theory is not able to, it doesn't fully equip us to figure out what we ought to do in these scenarios where these duties seemingly conflict. Okay, Ross is going to accommodate that concern. So this ultimately leads Frankena to conclude, quote, Kant's arguments, even if good, do not prove as much as he thinks. So let's move on to issue number 2. He's skeptical of this, relying solely on this idea of the categorical imperative to establish all of our duties. So you recall illustration 4, famous 4 illustrations of duty that Kant provides, is the well-off or prosperous curmudgeon. The guy that's billionaire but wants nothing to do with others and remains hands-off and refuses to get involved and help others that are obviously in need. And Kant, remember Kant's point, although we could conceivably universalize that, we can envision it as being, I should say, a universal way that people behave, right? Kind of being a universal law. There was no logical or rational contradiction in imagining that being a way to universally behave. We wouldn't want it to be, because at some point, right, we ourselves would stand in need of, that person would stand in need of the love and sympathy and financial aid in some cases from others, right? And they wouldn't want that mentality being reciprocated. Okay. Well, Frankena is going to home in on that example and point out how that's one example where, contrary to what Kant thought, if you reflect a little bit more, it doesn't seem like the categorical imperative does in fact establish benevolence, or that need or the duty to help others. Because if we go back to that 4th illustration, right, he wants to say there's 2 ways out, so to speak, or 2 ways that make sense where we can imagine someone who's applying the categorical imperative who wants to act that way, right, where they don't get involved, they have the opportunity to help, but they don't want to get involved in the plights of others. And he says, look, there are 2 kinds of people for whom they might apply the categorical imperative and yet still not be convinced after applying the categorical imperative that they have a duty to help the others. Take, for example, someone, he says, who's so well off, right, a billionaire who maybe is, I don't know how it's possible, right, but so emotionally sound, right, that they would never need financial, emotional, or any kind of support from others. Imagine, right, that maybe they're few and far between, but they're out there. There are those types of people. And so it's trying to say, well, you're going to want that in return. Well, that wouldn't work, right? That's not convincing. Or imagine a second type of person, he says, who, understands that, okay, in me acting this way and being the Kantian I am, I'd have to accept then that would be reciprocated, and this is how everyone would act, and I'm fine with that. Who's to say that's not a rational perspective as well? And so he wants to say for that sort of person, applying the categorical imperative isn't going to convince them then that in fact helping others in need is a duty, right? Because they could say, well, should I help others when I have the opportunity to? No. Can I universalize that? Well, sure. I mean, I realize that when I'm in need, they wouldn't help me, but that's fine. Maybe they prefer the scenario where you don't have people constantly trying to help one another or meddling. Maybe they might say meddling in one another's affairs. They prefer that to the scenario where they might actually get some help when they need it, but there wouldn't be that constant meddling. Okay. Well, again, he wants to say that seems rational, and then your categorical imperative, Kant, it didn't convince them that benevolence is a duty. And so that's an issue for Frankena, because as we'll see on the next slide, he agrees with Kant that helping others when we have the opportunity to is a duty, and is pointing out that the categorical imperative, contrary to what Kant thought, failed to actually show that. Okay, so this is him describing again those 2 types of people for whom applying the CI would fail to demonstrate benevolence as a duty. He says, quote, "It is not hard to imagine a man whose fortune is fairly sure," like we talked about, the billionaire who imagine, again, it's not just fortune is fairly sure financially, but they wouldn't need the love or support or an emotional sense, right? Imagine that there's some people out there that are super strong emotionally, financially, and so on. Quote, "It's not hard to imagine a man whose fortune is fairly sure, or one who is," the second type of person, "or one who is willing to be consistent and to take the consequences of his maxims being universally acted on." I'm fine with that. We just won't have people intervening in one another's affairs, including coming back my way. That's fine. If there are such people, Kant's test will not suffice to establish benevolence as a duty. And again, turning to slide 8, this is a problem for him because he agrees that benevolence really is a duty. So insofar as what Kant's telling us fails to establish that, that's a problem, right? It's insufficient in that sense. So that leads him to conclude, as I point out at the bottom of slide 8, quote, "Kant's test will not suffice to establish benevolence as a duty." So that's one clear example he wants to argue. Okay. Let's go ahead and turn to slide 9 then. So these two, how do you solve these? He wants to say, given what Kant gives us, what Kant tells us. Specifically, again, that idea of universalizing or not doing things we couldn't universalize. How do you solve these two issues? Okay. Now this third one, it's a problem given what Kant tells us, but given what Kant probably meant, we can still solve it. Okay. So what's the issue? We have, again, a general sense of what it means if a maxim, right? We're about to do something. What's the corresponding maxim? The maxim is basically, as we mentioned, right, the mode of expressed in universal terms. And so we ask ourselves, would that maxim, would it be something we could imagine or would want to be a universal way of behaving? Okay, we already know, I have a general sense, right, that if it's not, right, we couldn't imagine it being a universal way of behaving, or we wouldn't want it to be a universal way of behaving, then we know we have a duty not to act in that way, right, act on that maxim. But what do we do about arbitrary maxims? Okay, things like when alone in the dark whistle, or tie your left shoestring first. Should we view these as duties? Okay, and this seems particularly problematic because on the face of it, right, well, no. Okay, yeah, we could universalize that, right? Because if you think about it, tie a left shoestring first. About to tie my left shoestring. Being the thorough Kantian I am, I stop myself. Oh, apply reason. Wait a second. Apply the categorical imperative. Tie left shoestring first. Can I universalize that? There's nothing problematic about that. What now, though? Is it a duty to do this, or is it just okay? How should I view that? Compare that with tell the truth. Okay, can I universalize that? There seems to be no problem with that. Is that a duty? Is there a difference between those two? Right, they both pass the test. Is there a difference between the two? And what is that difference? And so he's saying Kant doesn't clearly flesh that out. For what it's worth, I agree with him. And he says, look, I can give you a best case scenario of what I think Kant meant and would probably suggest about this. And for what it's worth, I agree with Frankena here too. I do think that this is what Kant really probably ultimately meant. But he doesn't come out and clearly say it. So this is a quote here. That I quote on the bottom of, what is that? Slide 9. So I'll read it first here. Quote, Kant meant to say, A, that it's permissible. So, A, permissible. It's permissible to act on a maxim if and only if one can will it to be universal law. So obviously, if you can't will it to be a universal law, don't act on the maxim. We already know that, right? B, it's wrong to act on a maxim if and only if one cannot will it to be universal law, duh, right? And then C, it's a duty to act on a maxim if and only if one cannot will its opposite to be universal law. So this gets at the difference, okay, between tie your left shoestring first and tell the truth, okay? They're both permissible. They're both A, okay? Yes, we could universalize tying left shoestring first, and we can universalize telling the truth. But what makes telling the truth C, but not tie your left shoestring C? It's that we can't universalize the opposite of telling the truth. So I should have had tell the truth written up here as well. They both are A, right? But you should only view telling the truth as a duty because you couldn't will the opposite to be, right? Not telling the truth. You couldn't equally will that to be a universal law. Versus, that's not true of the arbitrary maxims like tie your left shoestring first, right? You could have equally universalized tie your right shoestring first. See, that's the difference, okay? And that's what he's picking up on here. So while tie your left shoestring first is permissible, it passes the test, it's not a duty because you could have willed the opposite. Versus telling the truth, not only is that A, that's permissible, you have to do it. It's a duty, it's C, because you can't will the opposite, not telling the truth, to be a universal law. Okay? So again, I think that's very important, and I think he's right that this is ultimately what Kant was getting at. Okay? Okay, so look, we get rid of this problem for you, Kant. Thank you, William, Mr. William Frankena, but we still have these two. And that seems to be an insurmountable difficulty then for the Kantian deontologist, Frankena wants to argue. So if we turn to 10 for a quick summary here, So in this most favorable light, right, we got rid of that third problem. We can get rid of the, sort of clarify the issues regarding the ambiguity of the CI. You still can't, given what Kant tells us, again, these things insurmountable. Okay, so even if it's the most favorable light, as I put it, Kant's moral criterion, or the categorical imperative, proves to be at best necessary, not sufficient. Okay. I like the way he actually puts it. So this is, again, a quote from him himself. He says, quote, "There's more," and this is why what the Kantian deontologist gives us is not sufficient. "There is more to the moral point of view than being willing to universalize one's rules." And they don't realize that, right? The idea is here. They just give us the CI and act as if that's it, right? You know, don't do things you can't universalize, and that's it. Well, they don't say, no, that's not good enough. There's these other problems. So there's more to the moral point of view than being willing to universalize one's rules. Kant and his followers failed to see this fact, so that's why what they gave us was not sufficient. Although, and this is him conceding that what they said is necessary, although they are right in thinking such a willingness is part of it. So that's interesting. He is acknowledging this bit about CI. Hey, I do like that. When it comes to figuring out what we ought to do, it does seem part of morality. It does seem like what it means to do the right thing, to not do stuff you wouldn't want to be universalized. So he's on board with that. That does seem necessary. His issue or his problem is just telling me that's not good enough, right? Because I'm not going to be able to know what to do, right, in all situations, you know, and it won't, in fact, establish all the duties I have, and so on and so forth. So I like what you're giving me, but it's not good enough. Right? That's the upshot, or that's really the ultimate stance that Frankena takes. Okay, so you know we spent a lot of time dissecting deontology and Kant and talking about what his theory looks like, and here we talked at length about what Frankena has to say regarding Kant's deontology. So turning then to the reflection, here you have the opportunity to chime in. What do you think of Frankena's criticisms? Is he right to suggest that what Kant says about morality is necessary but not sufficient? Do you agree with the ultimate upshot, right, that Kant's theory is lacking? And if so, is it for the same reasons that he alludes to? Maybe you also find it problematic that you can't access our motives and intentions. The problem that we've been alluding to since the lecture 11 videos. That might also be something that renders it insufficient in some sense. How about that sense that, hey, at least Kant was right that being able to universalize what you're doing, that does seem important to what we mean by morality. Is he right in that regard? Or do you want to argue, contrary to Frankena, that he's not even right with respect to that? That when it comes to doing the right thing, you need not be able to universalize what you're doing. That's not always necessary. So maybe you disagree with this very notion. And what about the idea that we can't salvage absolute duties? Are they unsalvageable? Given this sort of issue, this idea that they'll always conflict, right? There'll be, maybe not all the time, but there will be definitely times where to uphold one duty, you have to set aside another. Is there any way to salvage the idea of this notion of absolute duties with that issue in mind? And in class, I typically say the only kind of way I can think about it is if you imagine, right, there's only one absolute duty, in which case, and it would never be at odds with anything. But once you introduce, I think, any more than one, isn't it at least conceivable that there will be these instances where they might be at odds with one another? And then what? Then what do you do? Then you seem to have that problem. So I don't know. Maybe you'll be able to solve it. So that, again, is question 3 on reflection time. So that's the 3 questions there. So there you have it. There's deontology. We unpacked a lot with Kant. You're all Kantian experts now, right? And well, maybe not, right? But you're at least familiar with the categorical imperative, the general ideas that Kant was getting at. Why it's problematic to view things like the utilitarians and to emphasize the consequences, because then we start praising people that had bad intentions, or at least not morally praiseworthy intentions, he would argue. So we talked about all that. We talked about deontology in general, and again, it's sort of emphasis on the motives and intentions of the people and what precipitated the action rather than what follows the action. And we talked about all those illustrations of duty, the propositions of morality. So we unpacked a lot with the deontology, which then put us in a position to understand Frankena's issues with deontology. So hopefully these issues that he raises kind of make sense, and you're able to explain, say if you were to address them on a quiz, right, you would be able to explain these issues and then how they relate to that idea that what Kant gives us is, while necessary, not sufficient. You know, you'd be able to unpack that distinction as well, right? Necessary versus sufficient conditions and principles. So this is the last lecture in this section of the course. We did a lot of very substantial stuff here in the second part, or second section of the course. There were very important lectures, particularly that the first part of lecture 7, when we unpacked a lot of those terms and concepts at the beginning of the hedonistic utilitarianism lecture, and then also the beginning of the deontology, especially that part 1 of lecture 11. Especially significant because we again sort of tried to, for the first time, characterize both utilitarianism in lecture 7 and then deontology in lecture 11 for the first time, right? We tried to characterize them in general and talked about a lot of key concepts. Teleological versus deontological, right over the good, good over the right. So, especially if you're struggling with Kant, go back, review the lecture 11 videos, and, especially the first part, lecture 7, and then first part, lecture 11, we did a lot of important general concepts and distinctions. So those are particularly important. Anyway, hopefully, again, you understood what Frankena is getting at. That makes sense. If you have any questions, obviously, on any of the Section 2 material, don't hesitate to reach out. We, at this point, have gone through, then, two of the big three moral theories. And I've mentioned this before, but as a quick reminder, what I mean by that is if you were to poll, academic moral philosophers who subscribe to a moral theory, I would argue, 95% of them, let's say. I don't actually know the numbers here, but you get the idea. 95% of them would subscribe to one of the big three. Utilitarianism, which we discussed already, and then at the beginning of this section, and then deontology, which we ended the section discussing. And so you can, understand now why we spent so much time studying those two, because they are substantial moral theories. We've concluded our discussions of those two, although we'll still talk about them and reference them. But then in the beginning of, so utilitarianism, deontology, right, which were the main focus of the second section. But then the start of the third section, then what you have to look forward to is the third of the big three, and that's Aristotle's virtue ethics. So that's what we have on tap, and we'll talk a little bit about Buddhism then, lecture 14. And actually we have 3 ancients right off the bat, I think, in section 3. We'll have Aristotle, the Buddha, and then Plato. So we'll have a lot of interesting things on tap yet for section 3, but this will wrap up section 2. And so, again, if you're studying for the quiz at this point, you're probably turning toward the quiz now. Good luck on that. Make use of the study guides. Don't forget to reach out if you have any questions. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed this video that helped you, make more sense of Kant and, understand some of the issues people have had with Kant's version of deontology. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you when we discuss Aristotle and virtue ethics. Thanks.